I never expected my mother-in-law to move in. I thought she'd live out her golden years in her own house, or maybe a nice assisted living facility. But life has a way of handing you responsibilities you never asked for. And I've always been the kind of person who steps up, even when everyone else steps out. When my mother-in-law moved in, her children promised help. They'd pop by on weekends, they said. They'd handle the big decisions, the medical bills, the holidays. They'd share the load. But somewhere between the first home-cooked meal and the 10th late-night bathroom emergency, I realized I was alone. Her children, my husband's siblings, became nothing but ghosts on the other end of the occasional phone call, leaving me to carry the weight of their mother's declining health. I managed her medications, made her meals, sat with her during long nights when she couldn't sleep. I learned her stories, her secrets, her fears, stories she'd never shared with her own children, stories that changed how I saw her and how I saw them. When she passed away, they swooped in, these absentee children, hungry for closure, accolades, and maybe a slice of her estate. They gave me polite smiles and empty words. They patted my shoulder and asked about the funeral arrangements, never once acknowledging the years I'd given, the sacrifices I'd made. So I did the one thing they never expected. I wrote her obituary. And in those lines, I made sure the truth was known. If you've ever felt the sting of thankless caregiving, if you've ever been the one who showed up when everyone else didn't, this story is for you. So pour yourself a cup of something strong, settle in, and let me tell you how I took care of my mother-in-law for years, and how her obituary made her children pay. It started on a Tuesday morning, though the day itself was unremarkable. The sky was that low, slate gray that makes even cheerful neighborhoods look like the setting for a funeral. My husband was at work, the kids were at school, and I was halfway through folding a basket of laundry when the phone rang. "Mom can't manage on her own anymore," my husband's voice crackled through the line, equal parts worry and resignation. "The doctor says she needs round-the-clock care." I paused, a half-folded towel in my hand. I knew what he meant, but I needed him to say it. "And?" "She's coming here," he said, as if he'd just told me we were ordering pizza for dinner. "It's the only option." I took a deep breath, staring at the row of perfectly aligned towels, suddenly aware of how quickly that neatness would unravel. "When?" "Tomorrow," he said, voice cracking. "I'm sorry." It wasn't his fault. And yet, in that moment, it felt like it was everyone's fault. Hers, his, even mine, for being the sort of person who would never say no. The next morning, the doorbell rang, and there she was, my mother-in-law, flanked by my husband and a nurse's aide carrying a small suitcase. Her eyes darted around the house like a wary cat, scanning for territory to claim. I forced a smile as I stepped aside to let them in. "Welcome," I said, though it felt more like an invitation to battle. She settled into the guest room, the one I'd once used as my craft space, and unpacked her belongings with an air of finality. Her perfume, a strong floral scent, clung to every surface, as if she were marking her territory. At dinner that night, she sat at the head of the table, the same spot where my husband usually presided. The kids glanced at me, uncertain, while my husband pretended not to notice the subtle shift in power. My mother-in-law didn't just take the seat, she took command. "Pass the salt," she ordered, as if the world had always revolved around her needs. "Of course," I replied, my voice pleasant, my mind already taking notes. That was the thing about her. She knew how to claim space. She'd barely been here a day, and already her presence felt like a shadow creeping down the hallway. Every corner of the house seemed smaller, the air a little heavier. After dinner, while I loaded the dishwasher, she wandered into the kitchen and stood behind me, watching. "You always load it like that?" she asked, as if I'd been doing it wrong my entire life. Yes, I said evenly. She clucked her tongue, the sound sharp as a slap. Well, I suppose it's your house now. The words were meant to sting, a reminder that this had once been her son's home, her domain. But I smiled, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling while my husband slept beside me. The house felt different, like a puzzle with one piece forced in where it didn't quite fit. I knew that from that day forward, things wouldn't be the same. I thought of all the things that would come next: the appointments, the pills, the arguments, the tears. I thought of her children, my husband's siblings, who had suddenly vanished, their concern conveniently transferred to me. "She's your mother-in-law," my husband would remind me when I complained. "We have to help." I understood that, but as I drifted off to sleep, I also understood something else. I'd just become the default caregiver in a family that was all too willing to let someone else do the heavy lifting. In the coming days, I'd discover that the first visit was just the beginning. The power shifts had only started, the lines were only beginning to blur. And as the days turned into months, and then years, I'd find myself holding not just the household together, but a fragile web of family relationships that seemed to fray with every passing day. It all began that Tuesday morning, the day she moved in, the day my life became a test of patience, resilience, and grace under fire. Next up, I'll tell you how I learned to navigate the endless doctor's appointments, the sleepless nights, and the guilt that comes with caring for someone who never quite wanted you in the first place. Stay with me. This story is just getting started. It's funny how people can share blood but not responsibility. That realization hit me hardest about 2 weeks after my mother-in-law moved in, when the calls started trickling in. They came at odd hours, as if planned for the least convenient moment, just as I was rushing to get dinner on the table, or when I finally had a moment to myself after helping her get settled with her evening meds. Victoria called first, the eldest daughter who lived a few hours away, but might as well have been on another continent. Her voice was syrupy sweet, like honey hiding the sting of a wasp. "Hi, sweetie," she said, as if we were old friends. "How's Mom doing? Not too much trouble, I hope." I clenched the phone tight enough that my knuckles turned white. "She's fine," I said, the words feeling as tight as the grip on the receiver. "Oh, that's wonderful," she gushed. "You're such a blessing taking her in like that. I really wish I could be there, but you can't," I finished for her in my head, hearing the excuses she'd already perfected. I listened as she listed the reasons. Work was so demanding. The kids had activities. The dog had developed separation anxiety. My own kids, meanwhile, were learning to tiptoe around the house like tiny mice, afraid to make noise lest they disturb their grandmother's delicate sensibilities. Next came Alexander, the only son, who called precisely once every 10 days, like clockwork. His tone was brisk, efficient, as though checking in on his mother was another item on his to-do list, wedged between a conference call and a golf game. "How's Mom?" he'd ask, without waiting for a real answer. "She's okay? Great. Let me know if you need anything." But when I actually needed something, a prescription refill or a new medical device, he'd suddenly vanish like morning mist, too busy or too important to help. He always promised to check in next time. Of course, next time never seemed to arrive. There was also Elizabeth, the youngest, who lived only an hour away, but treated that distance as an ocean. She'd make grand declarations about visiting soon. "I'll pop over next weekend, promise." But the weekends came and went with no sign of her. Meanwhile, my days bled one into the next. I became the sun around which the household orbited. Meals, meds, doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, bills. If the kids were sick, it was my job to juggle them and their grandmother's needs. They, the Hamilton children, only saw her through the lens of occasional phone calls and holiday visits, a curated highlight reel of their mother's best days. They missed the reality, the nights when she'd wake up confused and call me by her late husband's name, the days when her legs refused to carry her from the living room to the kitchen, leaving me to lift her inch by inch while my back screamed in protest. They missed the stony silence at breakfast when I'd set her pills on the table and she'd scowl at them like they were poison. They missed the way her sharp tongue could lash out at the smallest perceived slight. "Don't you have something better to do than fuss over me?" she'd snap, as though I'd chosen this life of servitude for fun. I'd smile, a tight-lipped expression that I reserved especially for her, and reply, "No, this is my priority." Sometimes when I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, I barely recognized myself. My eyes were tired, my posture stooped, my hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail that had long since lost its bounce. This was my daily grind. This was my normal. And while I lived this reality every single day, her children breezed in once a month, if that, and commented on the state of the house or the color of the curtains. "Mother always loved a lighter shade in here," Victoria once said as she breezed through, high heels clicking across the floor like accusations. I bit back a retort, because in that moment, she wasn't talking about the curtains. She was talking about how I'd invaded her family's territory and made it my own. "Of course," I said, smoothing the fabric over the windows. "I'll see what I can do." After she left, I stood in that living room and let the silence close in around me. The house felt like a battleground, every piece of furniture a reminder of the territory I'd claimed just by caring for their mother. That's the thing about families divided by distance and denial. They expect the caretaker to hold the center while they remain the satellites. They think they can dip in and out as they please, call to offer half-hearted support, criticize from afar, while I bore the brunt of the responsibility. But I'd already started to realize, this house may have been built by the Hamiltons, but the life inside it now ran on my sweat, my tears, my quiet strength. Next up, I'll tell you about how those occasional visits turned into judgment sessions, each one testing my patience in ways I never expected. Stay tuned. This story is far from over. By the time the doctor appointments started to pile up, the phone calls from her children had become even more polite, just not any more helpful. It started with a sniffle. "A harmless, just a bit of a cold," she said one evening as I was clearing the dinner dishes. She waved off my concern with a dismissive flick of her hand, the same way she'd flicked away my attempts to help with her laundry, or the fact that she refused to use her walker, even though the doctor had recommended it. But that bit of a cold turned into a cough. That cough turned into chest pain. And that chest pain turned into a frantic call to the doctor's office, where the receptionist, God bless her patience, recognized my voice before I even introduced myself. "Yes, Mrs. Hamilton," she'd say, voice soothing, practiced in the art of managing worry. "We'll fit her in at 3 o'clock. I'd scribble it down in the tattered planner that had become my lifeline, each page filled with notes about medications, therapy, dietary restrictions, and now, endless doctor visits. At first, I thought the children might want to be involved. I called Victoria to update her, thinking she'd at least want to know. "Oh dear," she said, voice heavy with sympathy that stopped at the phone line. "That must be so hard on you. Let me know what the doctor says." She didn't ask if I needed help getting her mother there. She didn't offer to come along. She just left it to me, like always. Alexander, predictably, was no better. His response was a quick, "Keep me posted," before he was off the line, probably heading to another business meeting or golf game. Elizabeth, bless her, at least tried to sound concerned. "I wish I could be there," she said, but her voice was tight with that familiar guilt she'd never quite shake. And so it fell to me, again, to bundle her into the car, adjust the seatbelt around her fragile frame, and navigate the 15 minutes to Dr. Carlson's office. "Such a good girl," my mother-in-law would mutter as I helped her out of the car. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or offended at being called a girl at my age. But I kept my face calm, my voice even, because I'd learned early on that her gratitude was as fleeting as spring sunshine. The waiting room always smelled of antiseptic and despair. Old magazines stacked haphazardly, chairs that creaked when you shifted, a television stuck on an endless loop of soap operas. She'd sit beside me, her fingers worrying at the hem of her sweater, eyes darting around at the other patients. "Look at them," she'd whisper, "sicker than I am." But then the nurse would call her name, and she'd straighten her back, suddenly frail, her voice pitched high as she lamented every ache and pain to the doctor. Every appointment was a production. The sighs, the moans, the dramatic pauses for effect. "My legs just don't work the way they used to," she'd say. "It's a struggle to get through the day." And the doctor, patient and kind, would nod, adjusting medications, adding another prescription to the list that I would have to pick up, organize, and administer. Every sniffle was now a crisis, every ache a potential disaster. She'd have me call the doctor at all hours of the night, panicked about her blood pressure, her breathing, a bruise that might be a sign of something catastrophic. One evening, I found myself pacing the kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, as the after-hours nurse explained, yet again, that no, a single cough wasn't grounds for an ambulance ride. I thanked her and hung up, exhaustion pressing down on me like a lead weight. My own children were in their rooms, pretending to sleep, but listening with wide eyes. They'd learned that a single cough in the night could pull me from their bedtime stories to their grandmother's side. The house had become a medical ward, the kitchen table littered with pill bottles and blood pressure monitors. I kept track of everything, dosages, times, side effects, in that battered planner. If I missed a detail, I knew exactly who would notice. "Did you give me my evening pills?" she'd ask, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Yes, Maureen," I'd answer, my patience worn thin, but my voice still sweet. "You took them with your tea." She'd nod, still unconvinced. As the weeks wore on, the appointments multiplied. Specialists, tests, follow-ups. Each one another line on my planner, another line on my face. The children would call now and then, always with the same tone, concern laced with detachment. "How's Mom?" they'd ask. "Has she gotten worse?" Worse than what? I wanted to scream. Worse than a life lived at the mercy of others? Worse than children who couldn't be bothered to sit beside her at a single doctor's appointment? Instead, I'd say, "She's stable, but it's a lot." They'd sigh, their voices relieved that I had it covered. "Keep us posted," they'd say. And I did, because I always did. "Keep watching. I'll share the moments when those endless appointments weren't just about her. When they became about the weight of all those whispered insults, the doubt that gnawed at my mind, and how each visit to the doctor felt like proof that I was the only one who really cared. Stay tuned." Of all her children, Victoria was the one who always claimed to have everything under control. She was the golden child, the one who swooped in for holidays with designer handbags and stories of boardroom conquests, who gave her mother a kiss on the cheek and then spent the rest of her visit talking about herself. The first time she made one of her grand promises, we were sitting in the living room, the winter wind rattling the old windows. My mother-in-law was settled in her favorite chair, a threadbare quilt draped over her knees. I sat across from her, my own cup of tea cooling rapidly, as Victoria regaled us with tales of the latest merger she'd negotiated. "And don't worry, Mom," she said at the end of her speech, patting her mother's hand with all the performative warmth of a seasoned actress. "I'm going to handle everything. We'll get you the best care. I'll make sure you have everything you need." Her mother's eyes glistened with pride and relief. "You're such a good girl," she murmured, leaning back into her chair. Victoria beamed, her confidence filling the room like perfume. I wanted to believe her, just for a moment. I wanted to think that maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't have to carry this load alone. But the weeks turned into months, and Victoria's promises evaporated like morning dew. "Can you book Mom's next appointment? I'm just slammed with meetings." "Mom needs her medication refill? I'll call it in tomorrow. Oh, I forgot. Can you do it?" "I'm coming to visit next month, and we'll talk about her long-term care then." That visit was postponed, then postponed again. Meanwhile, every crisis fell to me. Every 3 a.m. coughing fit, every doctor's appointment, every medication refill, every sigh and moan that only I seemed to hear. Victoria's calls always started the same way. "How's Mom?" and ended the same way. "Thanks for keeping me in the loop." Her version of handling it all was staying informed, and my mother-in-law, bless her heart, never seemed to notice. Whenever Victoria called or dropped by, it was like a switch flipped. Her mother would sit up straighter, her voice suddenly stronger. "Oh, darling, I'm fine," she'd croon, her eyes sparkling. "You're so busy, I don't want to burden you." Meanwhile, I'd be standing in the kitchen, wiping down counters, my back aching from lifting her in and out of the bath, from running to the pharmacy, from staying up all night when her breath rattled like dry leaves. Victoria's visits were a production, a grand performance that required her mother to be the leading lady and me to be the silent stagehand. She'd bring flowers that would wilt in the vase by the end of the week, chocolates that my mother-in-law couldn't eat because of her diabetes, and a flurry of big plans that never quite materialized. "We should get Mom into that private clinic," she'd say, her eyes bright with ideas she'd never follow through on. "She deserves the best. I'll make some calls." Those calls never happened. Instead, I'd find myself on the phone with Dr. Carlson's office, asking about test results, medication interactions, and wondering why I was the only one in this house who seemed to understand that care didn't begin and end with a promise. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and my mother-in-law's breathing was finally steady, I'd sit in the living room and think about Victoria's empty words. "I'll handle everything," she'd said. Everything. Except the bedpans. Except the bruises that needed checking. Except the tears her mother cried when the pain got too much and she wanted to give up. That was my job. Victoria, with her tailored suits and carefully styled hair, could afford to make promises. She could afford to be the hero in her own story. But I knew better. I knew that every promise she made was another weight on my shoulders. Because I'd be the one picking up the slack. I'd be the one carrying her mother through the long nights. And maybe that's why, when my mother-in-law would ask, "Has Victoria called today?" I'd smile and say, "She's thinking of you," instead of telling her the truth. Because at the end of the day, even though Victoria was the favorite child, I was the one who stayed. Cooking for her was like playing a never-ending game of culinary roulette. Some days she'd devour everything in sight. Other days she'd look at a perfectly good meal as if I'd tried to serve her roadkill. It started simply enough. The Meals on Wheels van came by twice a week, dropping off neatly labeled containers, chicken casserole, turkey with mashed potatoes, the occasional mystery meat that even the label couldn't redeem. She'd inspect each container with a sniff and a grimace, like a queen deciding whether to pardon a peasant. "These are bland," she'd complain, wrinkling her nose at the gravy that had congealed into a sort of gray paste. So I'd find myself at the stove at 6 in the evening, apron on, stirring a pot of something she might actually eat. Her appetite was a finicky beast. Some days she craved the mashed potatoes. The next she insisted she'd never liked them. "Just a piece of toast," she'd say. But when I brought it to her, perfectly golden, buttered just the way she used to like, it would sit untouched, the butter melting into a sad, oily puddle. "I thought you wanted toast," I'd venture, though by now I knew better than to expect consistency. "Not that toast," she'd sigh, eyes on the television as if my presence were a minor annoyance. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at her, wondering how a woman who once ruled her kitchen with iron confidence had become so fragile, so difficult to please. I'd watched her as a child. Yes, the memories go back that far, commanding Sunday dinners with a wooden spoon in one hand and a rolling pin in the other. Now, that same spoon felt like a lead weight in my own hand. Meals on Wheels was supposed to be a convenience, but most nights it was me standing at the stove, trying to make something she'd actually eat. It didn't matter that I had a job, or that my own dinner often went cold. Her plate always came first. One night, after a particularly long day at the doctor's office, she said she just wanted soup. "Simple," she insisted. So I opened a can, one of those fancy organic brands she claimed she liked, and poured it into a pot. I heated it gently, stirred it carefully, and added a sprinkle of parsley, hoping it would look homemade enough to please her. When I set it down in front of her, she peered at it as if I'd just handed her a bowl of poison. "Is this from a can?" she demanded. "Yes," I admitted, though I'd added my own touch, just like she used to when she was healthy. Her lips pursed. "I can taste the metal," she said, pushing it away. In that moment, I felt every ounce of exhaustion from every meal I'd made, each one met with either disinterest or outright disdain. But I bit back my frustration, because the alternative was letting her starve. So I dumped the soup down the sink and started over. I took out the carrots, the celery, the chicken breast from the fridge. I chopped, stirred, and seasoned until the kitchen smelled like Sunday dinner, even though it was Tuesday, and I was too tired to stand. When I finally served it to her, she took one sip, then sighed. A long, dramatic sigh that said she'd been wronged by the universe. "It's too salty," she muttered. That was the moment I knew this was a battle I'd never win. But I'd keep fighting anyway. Because feeding her wasn't just about filling her belly. It was about holding on to the last shreds of dignity she had left. It was about showing her every single day that even if she couldn't taste the difference between homemade soup and a can, I would still make the effort. Victoria never saw that part. She'd come by once a month, bringing a box of fancy pastries she'd picked up at the airport. "For Mom," she'd say, as if she'd made them herself. Then she'd smile at me, tight, polite, like a flight attendant offering stale peanuts, and say, "Thanks for everything you're doing." Then she'd slip out, leaving me to throw away the pastries her mother couldn't eat and cook a meal from scratch. So I kept feeding her, night after night, meal after meal. Because even when she didn't thank me, even when she didn't eat, it was the one thing I could do. It was the one thing I could control. I wish I could say the worst part of caring for her was the cooking, the endless nights stirring pots of homemade soup just to watch her push it away. But no, the real endurance test was the medication. A small mountain of pill bottles lined the kitchen counter, their labels facing out like soldiers ready for inspection. Blood pressure, cholesterol, arthritis, antidepressants. Each bottle represented another part of her that was slowly betraying her. And it was my job to keep the rebellion at bay. It started innocently enough. One tiny pill box with neatly labeled days of the week. I thought I'd gotten the hang of it, placing a single pill in each slot like a cautious general plotting a week's worth of battle strategy. But then came the adjustments. The doctor changed one prescription, upped another, added a new one that couldn't be taken within 2 hours of the others. Suddenly, my pillbox strategy looked like a child's puzzle compared to the chaos I was about to inherit. "Don't forget her cholesterol pill has to be taken with food," the doctor's office nurse said, her voice chirpy, like she'd just reminded me to water the plants. And the arthritis one, she continued, shouldn't be taken at the same time as the antidepressant. It can cause complications. Complications. That word hung in the air like a threat. Every day became a carefully choreographed routine, lining up pills on a napkin, checking the clock, making sure the cholesterol pill had a slice of toast waiting next to it. I became an expert in drug interactions, a pharmacist without a license. Of course, there were always those days. The days when Victoria would call at 11 a.m. to say she'd checked in on Mom and that everything was going great. She's fine, she'd insist. She was in good spirits when I spoke to her. What she didn't know, what she never bothered to ask, was that I'd spent the entire morning cleaning up after breakfast, prepping lunch, and waiting for the clock to tick down to 11:45 so I could administer the next dose before her stomach got too empty. Because God forbid her stomach was too empty. That was a sure way to get a meltdown. If she forgot to take a pill, the rest of the day became a dance of symptoms and side effects. Miss a dose of her antidepressant, and she'd slip into a fog of confusion and tears. Miss the arthritis medication, and her hands would ache so badly she'd be unable to hold a fork at dinner. "You forgot my pill," she'd accuse, her voice brittle with betrayal. I'd check the schedule, double-check the napkin, the pill box. No, I hadn't forgotten. But somewhere between the television and her complaining about the Meals on Wheels lunch, she'd refused it, or spit it out. And it was still my fault. "Don't you care about me?" she'd demand, tears streaming down her cheeks. My stomach would twist, and I'd find myself apologizing even though I hadn't done anything wrong. Victoria never saw that part. She'd breeze in with her manicured nails and designer bag, ask about Mom's mood, and then disappear before the next dose was due. One evening, after a particularly rough day of medication marathons, Victoria called. "How's she doing?" she asked, the concern in her voice as fake as the plastic succulents she'd gifted me for Christmas. "She's stable," I said, staring at the pill bottles lined up on the counter like a reminder of my failure to keep her truly well. "Great," Victoria chirped, "because I think we're going to take her out to dinner on Sunday. Just a change of scenery, you know?" I paused, picturing Victoria trying to keep up with Mom's pill schedule between salad and dessert. The thought made me laugh, bitterly, softly. "Just remember," I said, "she needs her cholesterol pill with food and the arthritis pill an hour later." "Oh," Victoria faltered, "maybe you should come too. You know, just in case." I agreed. Of course, I agreed. Because even in the middle of their sporadic visits and occasional guilt-induced outings, I was the one who knew when and how the pills needed to be taken. And so the medication marathon continued. Every day I opened bottles, measured doses, counted pills, and watched the clock. It wasn't just the physical act of giving her the pills. It was the emotional burden of making sure she took them, the constant worry that I'd miss something critical. Because if I missed a dose, it was my fault. If she refused a pill, it was my fault. If she had a bad day, it was my fault. And so I kept running that marathon, day after day, week after week, until the routine became a kind of lifeline. Because at least with the medication, I could pretend I had some control over the slow, inevitable unraveling of her health. If I thought the medication was a test of endurance, it was nothing compared to the mental gymnastics of listening to her stories. Every afternoon after lunch, like clockwork, she'd settle into her armchair, wrapped in the same old Afghan that smelled like lavender and last week's lunch, and call me over with that expectant look. "Sit down," she'd command. "I've got a story for you." These weren't just any stories. These were grudges, carefully tended like the roses she once claimed to grow, though I never saw a single bloom in her yard. Every tale came with a villain, a neighbor who'd borrowed sugar and never returned the cup, a sister-in-law who dared to criticize her potato salad at the family picnic in 1984, the grocery clerk who gave her change with a smirk 15 years ago. Each one was an epic saga of betrayal, injustice, and petty revenge, spun into a drama that rivaled any soap opera on TV. "You wouldn't believe what she said," she'd start, her voice low and conspiratorial. "At my own mother's funeral, she said the flowers were too gaudy. The nerve." She'd pause for effect, eyes locked on mine, daring me to disagree. I'd learned quickly that there were only two acceptable responses. "You're absolutely right," or "How could she?" Anything else, even a neutral, "Maybe she didn't mean it that way," would send her into a tailspin of self-pity and indignation that could last for days. One story in particular she liked to revisit was about her brother's wife, that harpy, as she called her. According to my mother-in-law, the woman had once given her a Christmas gift of expired candy. She'd been holding on to that slight for decades, every retelling growing more elaborate. By the time I heard it, the harpy had not only given her expired candy, but had orchestrated a plot to ruin Christmas itself. "She's always been jealous of me," my mother-in-law would declare, her eyes flashing. "Always. Ever since I wore that red dress to the family reunion." That red dress came up a lot. It was, according to her, the pinnacle of fashion, and everyone had envied her. She'd lower her voice to a whisper, conspiratorial as ever. "You know who was the most jealous? Victoria. Even when she was little, she'd pout and whine because she didn't have a dress like mine. That's why she's so cold to me now. She never got over it." I'd nod, the same polite smile on my face, even as I wondered how a decades-old dress could spark such venom in a grown woman. Between medication rounds and doctor's appointments, I became her sounding board, her reluctant confidant. She'd recount the time the neighbor's dog barked at her, proof, she insisted, that the neighbor had trained it to dislike her. She'd talk about the nurse at her doctor's office who always has a chip on her shoulder because she didn't say "good morning" the right way. Every slight, real or imagined, was catalogued and preserved in the museum of her memory, ready for display at the slightest provocation. It didn't take long for me to realize that these grudges weren't just stories. They were weapons, carefully sharpened and ready to be deployed against anyone she felt had wronged her. Sometimes I'd catch Victoria's name slip in, like a dagger hidden in the folds of her robe. "Victoria always thought she was better than me," she'd say, her voice low and dangerous. "She never respected me, not even when she was little. Always had to be the center of attention. Always had to be Daddy's girl." I'd sigh and nod, careful to keep my face neutral, because the last thing I needed was to get caught in the crossfire between mother and daughter. These stories shaped how I saw the children, the ones who called every so often but rarely visited, the ones who thought a 5-minute phone call was enough to fulfill their duty. Maybe, I thought, they'd inherited her ability to hold a grudge. Maybe they'd learned from the best. Between her grudges and their indifference, I felt like the only adult in a family of children playing at being grown-ups. Every time Victoria swept in with her manicured nails and designer bag, I'd think back to the stories, the red dress, the Christmas candy, the endless complaints about being overlooked. It all connected, like the medication, the meals, the phone calls. A lifetime of grudges had built a fortress around her heart, one that no amount of pills or polite conversation could breach. And now it was my job to navigate that fortress, to duck the arrows she shot at her children, and sometimes at me, and keep her world in balance. Holidays in our house always felt like a dress rehearsal for a play I never auditioned for. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, it didn't matter. I was the lead actor, stage manager, set designer, and caterer, all rolled into one. Every year, without fail, the responsibility landed squarely on my shoulders. My mother-in-law, of course, expected nothing less. After all, in her eyes, I was the one who had the time and knew how to make things nice. Translation: I was the one who could be counted on to pick up the slack her children never bothered to consider. It always started the same way: an offhand comment about how everyone would love a proper meal together, delivered with a sigh heavy enough to flatten a turkey. Then, like clockwork, I'd find myself elbow deep in stuffing and gravy, while she supervised from the kitchen doorway, offering critiques like a reality TV judge. Don't forget the cloves in the ham, dear. That's the way it's always been done. Never mind that no one liked cloves. No, tradition mattered more than taste. The kids, her grown children, who could barely manage a weekly phone call, would show up with their families in tow, breezing in as if they'd come to grace us with their presence. They'd bring bottles of cheap wine and tales of their stressful lives, never pausing to consider that I had a life too, one that included catering to their mother's every whim. "Oh, you shouldn't have," they'd say, glancing at the spread of food, the table dressed to the nines. And then they'd proceed to complain. Every dish was subject to scrutiny. "Is this turkey organic?" Victoria would ask, raising an eyebrow. "Because you know the kids are sensitive to additives." Alexander would poke at the mashed potatoes, eyes narrowed. "Are these gluten-free? My wife's been on that diet." I'd bite my tongue and nod, having already juggled 3 different dietary restrictions like a circus act. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law would sit at the head of the table, beaming like a queen surveying her loyal subjects. "Isn't this lovely?" she'd croon, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. Or perhaps she wasn't oblivious at all. She thrived on it. Between refilling glasses and fetching second helpings, I'd catch snippets of conversation. Victoria complaining about the stuffing being too dry, Alexander asking if the sweet potatoes had enough brown sugar. "Last year's was better," he'd remark, as if that was helpful. Meanwhile, Catherine, the quiet one, would pick at her food and avoid eye contact, offering the occasional polite compliment that felt more like an apology than praise. Through it all, my mother-in-law would offer her own commentary, laced with passive aggression. "Well, dear, next time maybe a little less salt. My doctor says I have to watch my blood pressure." Or, "You didn't overdo it on the butter, did you? We don't want to clog anyone's arteries." She'd lean back in her chair, a satisfied smile on her face, as if her role in orchestrating this performance was complete. When the meal was finally over and the plates were cleared, the children would disappear, drifting off to the living room to argue over the TV remote or scroll through their phones. My mother-in-law would sigh theatrically and pat her stomach. "That was a lovely meal, dear. Now, I think I'll rest a bit. You don't mind cleaning up, do you?" Of course not, because after cooking for 12 and decorating every corner of the house to her exacting standards, the least I could do was handle the dishes too. Every holiday ended the same way. Me alone in the kitchen, scrubbing pans and wondering why I let myself be pulled into this circus year after year. The children would pop in now and then with a quick "thanks" that sounded more like an afterthought, and then they'd vanish, leaving behind a trail of crumpled napkins and half-empty wine glasses. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at the darkened dining room, the tablecloth stained with gravy and candle wax. I'd think about all the work that went into making the day special, and how none of it seemed to matter. It wasn't that I needed gratitude, though let's be honest, a simple thank you would have been nice. It was that every holiday felt like another reminder that I was the one holding everything together, while everyone else assumed it would just happen. My mother-in-law never missed a chance to remind me that holidays are about family, dear. And yet, for all her talk, she never once lifted a finger to make them easier. I'd stand there, up to my elbows in suds, listening to her laughter drift from the living room as she recounted her stories, those same grudges I'd heard 100 times, to an audience too polite or too disinterested to protest. And every year, I'd wonder when it would end. When would they see that the holidays didn't just magically appear, that someone had to make them happen? someone who gave up her own comfort for theirs. Money was always a touchy subject in our house, especially when it came to my mother-in-law. From the moment she moved in, a polite fiction formed around the idea of everyone chipping in. Her children talked a big game about taking care of mom, but when the credit card bills landed in my mailbox, guess whose name was on them? It started innocently enough. She'd need a prescription, and I'd pick it up while I was already at the store. "I'll pay you back," she'd say with a sweet smile. And I believed her, at first. Then came the small household things: toothpaste, shampoo, a new pair of slippers because the old ones were too drafty, always accompanied by a promise of repayment that never materialized. At the beginning, I kept a neat little notebook in the kitchen drawer, a ledger of sorts, tracking every dollar I spent on her behalf. I thought that would keep things clear and fair. "Just so we're all on the same page," I'd say when one of her children visited. They'd nod solemnly, thanking me for my thoroughness, then quickly change the subject. After a while, the ledger started to feel more like a to-do list for Santa Claus. Check it twice, but no one else was going to believe in it. Her children, the ones who always promised they'd take care of everything, had a talent for disappearing when the bills came due. Victoria, the eldest, always said she'd handle it, but had a curious habit of misplacing her checkbook. Alexander, who fancied himself the family financier, would talk about settling up when he got a chance to look at the numbers. I'm still waiting for that chance. And Catherine, sweet but scatterbrained, would blush and promise to Venmo me tomorrow, which apparently meant the day after never. Meanwhile, the expenses piled up. Doctors' copays, medical equipment, heating bills that seemed to double once she moved in because old bones get so cold. And then there were the groceries. Her children would swing by once a month with a carton of almond milk or a fancy loaf of bread, as if that covered the 3 meals a day I put on the table. "We're all so grateful for what you do," Victoria would say, her voice dripping with sincerity. "We just don't know how you manage it all." Spoiler alert, I managed it with my own bank account. I learned to smile and say, "Of course it's no problem," because that was easier than fighting about it. Easier than asking a grown man or woman to help pay for their own mother's care. I told myself I was doing it for her. She was family now, after all. But there were nights when I lay awake calculating the totals in my head, wondering how long I could keep this up. Once, I tried to bring it up at one of our family dinners, right after I'd cleared everyone's plates and served dessert. "We should talk about Mom's expenses," I said, voice carefully neutral. The air went still. Alexander actually checked his watch, as if I'd scheduled a finance meeting at an inconvenient time. "Of course," Victoria said, all teeth and tight lips. "We should definitely discuss that. Let's plan something for next week." Next week, of course, never came. Every month, the bills landed on my kitchen counter: electricity, water, heating oil. And every month, I wrote the checks. I told myself it was just easier than arguing. That someday they'd realize what I'd done for her, for them. That maybe they'd even thank me. But the thanks never came. Instead, I got the same polite excuses, the same earnest promises. And as her health declined, each chapter in this story a slow descent, I found myself paying not just in dollars, but in sleepless nights and a creeping sense of resentment I couldn't shake. The children would occasionally float big ideas. "We should get her on a payment plan for the home nurse," or "I'll talk to the insurance company next week." But when the bills arrived, guess who was left holding them? Me, like always. And when I asked for help, rarely, because asking felt like admitting defeat, I got the same chorus. "Oh, of course. Just let us know how much." Then the silence that followed was louder than any words. The final straw came one winter when the heating bill shot up to cover her space heater, which she insisted on leaving on all night. "I'm too old to be cold," she'd say, her voice full of righteous indignation. I agreed with her, of course. No one wants to freeze. But when the bill came in at nearly double the usual amount, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the figure, my pen poised over the checkbook. Not a single one of her children had offered to pitch in. Not one. I wrote the check. I always did. They say caregiving is an act of love. They say it's a privilege. But no one ever talks about the cost. The silent, hidden cost that doesn't show up on any medical bill or bank statement. It's the cost that kept me awake at night and left me staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made the right choice every time I tucked her in and whispered goodnight, like I was soothing a child. From the moment she moved in, my life changed. Overnight, I became the nurse, the cook, the housekeeper, and the emotional sponge that soaked up every drop of worry, anger, and fear. Her children would show up for the occasional birthday or Sunday lunch, bringing flowers and their best smiles. "Thanks for everything you do," Victoria would say, her voice sticky sweet. Then she'd disappear before the dishes were cleared, leaving me to handle the tears that came later, when mother-in-law's smile faded and she started asking the same questions she'd already asked 3 times that day. They didn't see the way her moods shifted like the wind, how one minute she'd be sweet as pie and the next a storm of complaints and accusations. "You moved my slippers again," she'd snap, convinced I was trying to sabotage her. "You're the only one who cares about me," she'd say, minutes later, eyes brimming with tears. I'd nod, stroke her hand, and tell her she was loved. Because that's what you do. You carry the emotional burden that no one else wants. When her health declined, when every cough or sniffle turned into a full-blown crisis, I was the one who calmed her. "It's just a cold," I'd reassure her as I prepared the thermometer. When the doctor's office put her on hold, I was the one pacing the kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, waiting for someone to pick up. And when she needed comfort, really needed it, after a scare or a bad night, I was the one who sat by her bed, holding her hand until she drifted to sleep. No one saw that part. They saw the shopping lists and the meal plans. They saw the neat stack of prescriptions lined up on the counter. But they didn't see the nights I cried in the shower, or the days I clenched my teeth so hard my jaw ached because she'd lashed out at me, calling me ungrateful, selfish, sometimes even worse. "Don't you have something better to do than hover over me?" she'd snap, moments after telling me she felt abandoned. It was like that, a constant push and pull, a dance of contradictions. I'd reassure her that I was there for her, that I cared, that I'd never let her down. And I meant it. But inside, I was exhausted. Not just from the chores and the bills and the errands, but from the endless effort it took to be her safe harbor when the world turned dark. Sometimes I'd watch her children come by with their forced smiles and hurried conversations. "She looks good," they'd say, eyes on their phones. "She's lucky to have you." Then they'd be gone, off to their lives where they didn't have to think about doctor's appointments or which foods wouldn't upset her stomach. Off to their jobs and yoga classes and dinners with friends. And I'd be left in the quiet, cleaning up the dishes and steeling myself for the evening routine. Medications, comfort, stories repeated for the 100th time. I became an expert at hiding my exhaustion. I'd greet them with a smile, assure them everything was under control, make sure they didn't see the cracks. Because if they saw the cracks, maybe they'd think I wasn't doing enough. Maybe they'd think I was failing. I couldn't let that happen. Even on days when my own heart felt too heavy to lift, I lifted it anyway. I reminded her that she was loved, that she mattered, that she wasn't a burden, even though sometimes in the quiet of the night, I felt like she was. I hate admitting that, even to myself. But that's the ugly truth no one talks about. Caring for someone isn't always sunshine and roses. Sometimes it's just heavy. so heavy you wonder if you can carry it another day. But I did. Because that's what love does, even when no one notices. Even when her children breezed in and out with their expensive handbags and easy promises. Even when the phone calls came too late, after the hard part was over, with a breezy, "Thanks for handling everything." I carried it. Every tear, every worry, every midnight panic attack. I carried it all. And the worst part? They never saw it. They saw the clean kitchen and the cheerful hello. They saw the meal on the table and the medication neatly sorted. But they never saw me. Tired, worn out, clinging to the edge of myself. They didn't see the real cost. It started like everything else had. Quietly, with an appointment that didn't seem like a big deal. A simple checkup, a quick drive to the clinic. But then came the follow-ups, the referrals, the tests. And before I knew it, the car seat beside me wasn't empty anymore. It was permanently occupied by the passenger who'd come to rule every aspect of my life. "Are you sure this is the right building?" she'd ask, clutching her purse like a lifeline, eyes darting from sign to sign as if expecting an ambush of white coats and stethoscopes. And I'd smile, reassure her, and hold her elbow as we navigated the maze of hallways lined with faded art and antiseptic scents. It wasn't just the doctor's offices. It was the constant paperwork, the insurance forms that seemed written in a secret language only bureaucrats understood. "Where's my insurance card?" she'd ask, every single time, even though I kept it in the same pouch in her bag, carefully labeled with bright tape. Every single time. And every time I'd find it, again, and hand it to her with a smile like it was the first time. Because that's what caregivers do. We hide our sighs behind our smiles and pretend it's easy. I became the translator, the interpreter of medical jargon that made her eyes glaze over. "What did the doctor say?" she'd ask as soon as we left the exam room, clutching her paperwork as if it might bite her. I'd explain, again, what blood pressure meant, what monitoring meant, what follow-up in 3 months meant. And every time I'd watch her nod with a glassy look, storing it in that mental filing cabinet that always seemed to lose the most important notes. Her children, of course, were too busy to come along. "Can you let me know what the doctor says?" they'd text breezily, as if I had time between juggling her appointments and my own life to craft detailed medical reports for them. They didn't see the hours spent in waiting rooms, the magazines from 2014, the endless loop of bad TV shows on silent screens. They didn't see me with my clipboard, taking notes, asking questions, advocating when the nurse missed something or the doctor seemed rushed. They didn't see the real work. No, they got the summary. "Doctor says it's manageable." Or, "We're adjusting her meds." Always in that calm, composed voice I'd perfected, never betraying the exhaustion behind it. Never letting them hear how my voice sometimes trembled when the doctor looked concerned. Because worry was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not when I had to be the strong one, the calm one, the one who held it all together. It wasn't just the physical appointments. It was the phone calls, too. The endless hold music, the robotic voice telling me, "Your call is important to us," while I waited to speak to the nurse or the pharmacy. Every refill was a negotiation, every specialist a new maze of paperwork and follow-ups. And every time, it was me. Just me. And when they did decide to show up, usually after a guilt trip or a particularly pointed comment at Thanksgiving, she'd smile and tell them how wonderful I was. "I don't know what I'd do without her," she'd say, patting my hand as if that was enough to make up for the hours I'd spent fighting insurance companies or driving her home in the pouring rain after a too long appointment. And they'd nod and smile and say, "Oh, you're amazing," before disappearing back to their real lives, where the most urgent decision was which yoga class to take. Every appointment, every test, every prescription, each one a tiny thread in a tapestry that felt like it might unravel at any moment. And I held it together, thread by thread, because there was no one else, no backup, no tag team partner to pass the baton to. Just me, with my checklist and my worn-out patience, and my car that always smelled faintly of antiseptic wipes and old lady perfume. And when she'd ask, "Do I have another appointment soon?" I'd answer calmly, "Not for a while," even though my calendar was already marked with the next 5 visits, each one a looming reminder that this job, this life, never truly paused. Sometimes I'd daydream about calling her kids. "Why don't you take her to the cardiologist this time?" I'd imagine myself saying. "Why don't you sit in that freezing waiting room with the uncomfortable chairs and the coughing stranger next to you?" But I never did. Because I knew what they'd say. Some version of, "We're so busy," or "You're so good at it," or "Mom feels most comfortable with you." And the worst part? They'd be right. She did feel most comfortable with me. So I kept going. One appointment at a time. One refill at a time. One more mile on the car, and one more smile for her, even when I felt like screaming. Because the burden of care wasn't just in the physical labor. It was in the emotional labor of being her one constant in a world that had forgotten how to show up. And tomorrow? Tomorrow would bring another waiting room, another folder full of test results, another day of being the tag team of one. But for tonight, I'd sit with my cup of tea and my planner, reviewing tomorrow's itinerary with the quiet resignation that only a full-time caregiver knows. They never warned me about the nights, the hours when the house went silent, and the darkness crept into every corner like a patient predator. The time when the daytime distractions, doctor's appointments, errands, endless phone calls, slipped away, leaving me alone with the stillness and her fears. It always started the same way. I'd be cleaning up dinner, wiping down the counters, thinking maybe, just maybe, I'd have a quiet evening. But then, like clockwork, the call would come. "Could you come here a minute?" She'd call from her room, her voice small and quivering like a child's. I'd pause, breathe in that moment of hesitation, then wipe my hands and head to her side. She'd be sitting up in bed, clutching the covers as if they were the last line of defense against the shadows. "Did you lock the doors?" she'd ask, eyes darting like a cornered animal. Every night, I'd reassure her. Yes, the doors were locked, the windows secured, the lights left on in the hallway just like she liked it. And every night, it wasn't enough. "They're going to come for me," she'd whisper, eyes wide with some memory from long ago. "Don't you hear them outside?" I'd glance at the closed curtains, the quiet street beyond, and shake my head. "No one's out there," I'd say softly, taking her hand in mine. "You're safe here." But she'd cling tighter, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. Sometimes it was her old stories, the ones she'd told 100 times over dinner or during long car rides to yet another doctor's appointment. But at 2 a.m., they took on a different tone. The time she found a mouse in her childhood home's pantry, now retold with trembling lips as a tale of invasion and betrayal. The time her sister stole her dress for the spring dance, now a twisted drama of lifelong rivalry that still made her seethe. She'd stare at the ceiling as if watching a movie no one else could see, her words coming in bursts, half-formed sentences that trailed off into nothing. And I'd sit beside her, listening, nodding at the right moments, holding her hand as the clock ticked on. And always, always, there were the emergencies. The cough that suddenly meant she was dying. The ache in her knee that had to be a blood clot. The funny feeling in her chest that couldn't wait until morning. I'd go through the routine every time. Check her pulse, check her breathing, remind her we'd seen the doctor just that week and that all was well. And every time, she'd look at me with the same haunted eyes and say, "You'll stay with me, won't you?" I stayed. Every time. Some nights I'd watch the shadows dance on the walls and wonder how many more nights like this I could take. I'd think about her children, the ones who got to sleep through the night, who didn't have to calm her fears or decipher her stories. The ones who'd call at 10 a.m., chipper and bright, asking how she was doing as if they'd just remembered she existed. And I'd answer, "She's doing fine," because what else could I say? The loneliness hit hardest in those hours between midnight and dawn. It was as if the whole world had gone to sleep, except me and her, and the house that felt too big and too small all at once. I'd sit on the edge of her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, telling her stories of my own childhood, just to distract her from her own memories. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes she'd smile and drift off mid-sentence, leaving me holding the thread of a conversation that never quite made it to the end. And then I'd tiptoe out, the floorboards creaking just enough to remind me that I wasn't truly alone, that the house had its own ghosts, its own history. I'd pause at her door, watching her sleep, the lines on her face softened by the half-light, and I'd feel a pang of something, pity, maybe, or regret. Or maybe just the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that doesn't have a name. By 4 a.m., I'd finally slide into my own bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many more nights I could do this. Wondering if her children would ever understand what those hours cost me. Wondering if she knew. But then morning would come, and the phone would ring, and the world would start spinning again. And I'd get up, put on my smile, and be ready to start it all over. If there were medals for ingratitude, her children would have taken gold, silver, and bronze. I'd spent more nights than I could count comforting their mother at 2 a.m., and still they acted like I'd done nothing more than the bare minimum, if that. It was a job that never ended, and each day seemed to bring a new record-breaking performance in the ingratitude Olympics. It started with the phone calls that never came when I actually needed them. Days would pass without so much as a text, but the moment something minor went wrong, a doctor's appointment rescheduled, a medication running low, or her stomach acting up again, my phone would light up like Times Square on New Year's Eve. And it was always the same script. Didn't you double-check that? Couldn't you have planned better? As if I'd done nothing but lounge on the couch all day, flipping through magazines. Then there were the side comments. Oh, the side comments. At holidays, over coffee, even in her hospital room. Victoria, the golden child, who lived 2 states away and visited twice a year, always with a new handbag and a matching attitude. "Well, if she's so sick, maybe you're not caring for her properly," she'd say, twisting her lips into that practiced frown of concern that never reached her eyes. Or Alexander, with his permanent phone glued to his ear, tossing out, "Couldn't you have arranged this better?" As if coordinating her medication schedule with his conference calls was my full-time occupation. And let's not forget Catherine, the one who stayed quiet, but never missed a chance to sigh dramatically or raise an eyebrow when I mentioned how hard the nights were. "Well, you did say you'd take care of her," she'd murmur, as though I'd volunteered for sainthood and was now whining because the halo was too heavy. Every time I thought I'd reached the bottom of their indifference, they'd dig a little deeper. Like the time I'd spent all day with her at the ER because she'd had a panic attack, her chest tight, her hands trembling, convinced she was having a heart attack. We'd sat there for hours, just the two of us, while the waiting room filled with the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee. I held her hand. I reassured her. I filled out the forms. I even called her children to let them know what was happening. Not one of them showed up. Not one. The next day, I got a group text. "Hope she's feeling better. Let us know when you have more info." As if I was the family nurse on call, not a human being who'd spent the night sitting upright in an uncomfortable plastic chair. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just sighed and typed back a polite update. It wasn't just the emergencies, though. It was the daily grind that no one saw. The laundry that piled up with her incontinence mishaps. The meals she'd refused to eat. Pushing away a carefully prepared bowl of soup with a wrinkled nose and a sigh. The medications that needed constant refilling. The phone calls to the pharmacy. The insurance paperwork that made me want to crawl under the table. None of that made their highlight reel. Instead, they'd show up for 5 minutes, pat her hand, and call themselves heroes. "She's so lucky to have us," Victoria would say, carefully dabbing at her lipstick in the mirror. I'd have to bite my tongue to keep from asking, "Where were you last night at 2 a.m. when she was crying because she couldn't remember if the front door was locked?" But I never said it. I just smiled and offered them coffee. Sometimes, in the rare quiet moments, I'd think about how she'd come to depend on me for everything. How I'd become the one constant in her world. The one she called for in the middle of the night. The one who knew her routine and her fears. And I'd wonder, did her children even know her anymore? Did they see her as a person, or just a responsibility to be checked off a list? And in those moments, I'd feel a twinge of pity. For them, not for her. Because one day she'd be gone, and they'd have to live with the memory of all the phone calls they never made, the visits they never took, the gratitude they never expressed. And me? I'd have the memories of every meal refused, every sleepless night, every thankless task. But I'd also have something they didn't. The knowledge that I was there, that I did the work, that I gave her everything I had, even when no one else did. If there's one thing I learned while caring for my mother-in-law, it's that every hour of help is worth its weight in gold, and no one wants to pay for it. The day I finally hired outside help was the day I realized just how alone I really was. It started the morning I found myself nodding off during one of her endless stories about the good old days. My eyes half closed, her voice a blur of familiar complaints. The neighbor's cat, the children who never called, the meal she didn't like last night. I caught myself slumping in my chair, chin nearly on my chest, before I jolted awake with a gasp that made her eyes go wide. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, as if she'd only just noticed how tired I was. That's when I decided I couldn't keep doing this alone. I needed help. Someone to shoulder the load, even if only for a few hours a week. But the second I mentioned it to Victoria, she turned up her nose. "Is that really necessary?" she asked, as though I was trying to get out of changing a diaper instead of just keeping myself from collapsing. "I mean, that's what family is for." Yes, family. That elusive concept they loved to wave like a flag whenever they wanted to guilt me into more unpaid labor. And yet, family was nowhere to be found when the real work needed doing. So, with or without their approval, I hired Janice, a sweet, capable woman with decades of experience and the patience of a saint. She wasn't cheap, but she was worth every penny. Janice came twice a week at first. She helped with the laundry, supervised my mother-in-law's meals, and handled the constant medication shuffle that made my head spin. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I could go to the grocery store without worrying if the house would burn down, or if my mother-in-law would wander into the street in her slippers. Of course, the minute Victoria found out, she had opinions. "I just think it's a waste of money," she sniffed over the phone, the disapproval dripping from her voice like syrup. "I mean, we all manage our own households without hired help." I wanted to laugh. Victoria had a live-in nanny, a cleaning service, and a dog walker for her precious golden retriever. But God forbid I hire someone to keep her mother safe. "Well, it's my money," I reminded her, a touch sharper than usual. "And my time." She didn't like that. Neither did Alexander, who once suggested I was trying to offload my responsibilities. He said it like I'd hired someone to raise my own child instead of ensuring his mother didn't choke on her dinner. And Catherine, always the diplomatic one, gave me a small, worried smile and a gentle, "Do you think it's really necessary?" Necessary. I'd have liked to see any of them step into my shoes for a week, no, a day, and manage her endless stories, her accidents, the constant laundry, the meals she refused, the medication that made her dizzy, the emergencies at all hours. Then they'd see necessary. The thing is, Janice never complained. She never rolled her eyes or sighed dramatically. She washed the sheets, cooked the meals, administered the meds. She even listened, really listened, when my mother-in-law told her about her childhood cat or the neighbor's annoying lawn ornaments. And every time Janice left, my mother-in-law would sigh wistfully. "She's such a dear," she'd say. "She really cares about me." As if I didn't. As if I hadn't been the one who fought to get her prescriptions filled when the pharmacy ran out. As if I hadn't sat up with her during the stomach flu or changed the sheets at 3 a.m. But Janice got the praise, and I got the bills. Every time I paid her, I thought about how none of them, Victoria with her designer shoes, Alexander with his endless business trips, Catherine with her perfect children, had offered to contribute. Oh, they were quick to voice their concerns, to question whether I was managing things properly. But when it came to pulling out their wallets, they were suddenly silent. So I paid. And when the bills stacked up, I paid some more. Because no one else would. Because every time I tried to talk about money, they'd get that tight, uncomfortable look on their faces and suddenly remember they had another call to take or an important meeting. Every week, as I handed Janice her check, I felt a mixture of relief and resentment. Relief that she was there. Resentment that it was all on me. And as the weeks turned into months, the resentment grew. Because as much as they tried to pretend otherwise, this wasn't just about money. It was about respect. It was about the fact that I was the one who made sure their mother's days were as good as they could be, and that I did it alone. It started with a box labeled Christmas decorations, the kind you expect to find fake wreaths and a tangle of old lights in. I'd only gone up to the attic to hunt for a garland she insisted would make the house look less like a funeral home during the holidays. But when I pulled that box down and dusted it off, I found something that made my knees go weak. A manila envelope marked Last Will and Testament. It wasn't the official copy. I knew that much. It was handwritten in a script that reminded me of all the grocery lists she'd left me over the years. Neat, precise, and in all caps, as if she were shouting even from the grave. I sat down on the rickety old trunk that doubled as a spider condo, the envelope trembling in my hands. A part of me wanted to put it back and pretend I hadn't seen it. But curiosity, and a pinch of self-preservation, got the better of me. After all, I'd spent years caring for her, cleaning her messes, driving her to every appointment while her kids called every other week to check in. I deserved to know. So I opened it. The first page started with the usual pleasantries, her name, date of birth, the expected legal disclaimers. And then, in her scratchy block letters, the real meat of the matter. To my son Alexander, I leave the silver tea set and the family Bible. Of course. Alexander, with his high-dollar suit and perfectly polished grin, who couldn't be bothered to call more than once a month. To my daughter Victoria, I leave my jewelry and the dining room table. The dining room table that I'd polished, set, and served every holiday meal on. The same table where she'd scolded me for not using the proper silverware, as if I'd ever been given a chance to learn. To my daughter Catherine, I leave my collection of cookbooks and my grandmother's quilt. That one hurt the most. Catherine, who never spent more than a long weekend in this house, was the one who got the quilt, the one I'd washed, patched, and folded countless times, the one she'd always said she'd get around to giving me. I flipped to the next page, hoping, praying, for some acknowledgement of everything I'd done. of the years I'd spent wiping tears and cleaning bedpans, of the nights I'd stayed awake through her fevers and her nightmares. But my name didn't come up until the very end. To my daughter-in-law, I leave my sincere thanks for her years of care. No silver, no jewelry, not even the old recipes she used to hoard like treasure. Just a single dry sentence of sincere thanks, as if that would pay the bills I'd racked up, or the hours I'd never get back. It was a punch to the gut, one I felt all the way to my toes. I sat there on that dusty trunk, my tears soaking the draft of a will that didn't even have a signature yet. Because that was the other thing. This wasn't the final copy. Just a draft. A snapshot of what she'd intended at one point in time, scribbled and left to gather dust while I gathered gray hairs. Part of me wanted to scream. Another part of me wanted to laugh. After all, I'd always suspected I was last on her list of priorities, and here it was in black and white. I could almost hear Victoria's voice, cool and dismissive. Well, that's fair, right? You're just the daughter-in-law. But fair wasn't the word that came to mind. And as I folded that draft back into the envelope, I felt something inside me harden. Because if she'd intended to leave me nothing, after everything, I'd at least been given the clarity I needed. It was around that time I realized that this will, this unsigned draft, wasn't the final word. It was a signpost. A reminder that the people who should have stood beside me saw me as an afterthought. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what I needed to start thinking about my own future. Because if I was the afterthought in her story, I'd make sure I was the headline in my own. When I came downstairs, the kids were calling again. Victoria, asking if I'd found the garland. Alexander, wondering if I could run to the pharmacy for him because he was absolutely slammed at work. Catherine, politely asking about her mother's medication schedule, but never offering to take a shift. I told them all I'd handle it, just like I always had. But upstairs, hidden in that attic, was a reminder that I'd handled far more than they'd ever know. I'll never forget the smell of that hospital room. Antiseptic laced with stale flowers, a hint of sweat, and something far more sour: fear. My mother-in-law, who'd spent a lifetime controlling every conversation, lay small and frail in a bed that seemed far too big for her. And me? I was perched on the hard plastic chair, one hand on her thin wrist, the other clutching a styrofoam cup of coffee that had long gone cold. It had been just me for days. Me with the nurses, the beeping monitors, the endless questions about DNRs and next of kin. I'd slept in that room, eaten in that room, watched her slip in and out of lucidity. Every time her eyes fluttered open, they searched the room, sometimes finding me, sometimes staring right through me, and occasionally lighting up with a flicker of recognition. But not for me. Never for me. And then, like vultures drawn by the scent of something dying, they came. Victoria was first, breezing in with a purse that probably cost more than my car and a cloud of designer perfume that made my eyes water. She swooped in like she'd just come from brunch with the mayor, hugging the nurses with the kind of practiced smile she reserved for board meetings. "Mother," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's forehead, as if she'd been there every day. I watched her, my lips pressed into a tight line. Alexander wasn't far behind, his phone glued to his ear as he negotiated a deal. No, a conference call, he said, as though that somehow excused his absence. He didn't even look at me when he finally ended the call and leaned over the bed. "Hey, Mom," he murmured, like he'd just popped by on his lunch break. Catherine, to her credit, looked genuinely uncomfortable. She hovered near the door, clutching a reusable shopping bag like a security blanket. She didn't say much, just offered me a small, tentative smile before taking her mother's hand. At least she had the decency to look guilty. For days it had been me, and now, when the finish line was in sight, they all appeared. The tears came on cue, of course, delicate dabs at the corners of their eyes with monogrammed handkerchiefs. Their voices were hushed, reverent. "We love you so much, Mother," Victoria crooned, her hand resting on her mother's chest like a priest administering last rites. And through it all, I sat there, feeling like an unpaid extra in a soap opera I'd been starring in for years. I'd done the 2 a.m. medication rounds, the 3 a.m. panic attacks, the 4 a.m. bathroom trips. I'd cleaned her, clothed her, comforted her. And now these people, her children, her chosen ones, wanted to swoop in and collect their inheritance of memories and guilt-free consciences. They started talking about the funeral arrangements while she was still breathing. Victoria took the lead, naturally, outlining a grand affair with white lilies and a string quartet. Alexander nodded in all the right places, his mind clearly somewhere else, probably on a spreadsheet. Catherine said she'd help, but her voice trembled. Every time I tried to speak, about her favorite flowers, about the music she'd loved, Victoria would interrupt. "That's lovely, but I think Mother would prefer something more dignified." Dignified. As if my years of care had been anything less than dignified. The nurse came in to check her vitals and gave me a small nod, the kind only people who've been in the trenches together can share. I stood to let her work, and Victoria pounced on my chair like a cat on a sunny windowsill. She reached for her mother's hand, tears welling. "I've always loved you, Mother," she whispered. A single, perfect tear rolled down her cheek. Alexander sighed, glancing at his watch. "I've got a call in 20 minutes, he muttered. Catherine squeezed her mother's hand and looked over at me. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. She meant it. I could see it in her eyes. But the words felt too small, too late. I stood there, watching them claim their piece of her. I was the one who'd been there for every cough and every sleepless night. But now they were the ones with the front row seats to her last act. It was then I remembered the will I'd found in the attic, the draft that had left me with nothing but sincere thanks. I wondered if they'd even read it, if they'd even known it existed. Probably not. They'd never bothered to look past their own schedules and self-importance. As the machines beeped their steady rhythm, I realized that soon it would all be over. And then it would be my turn to decide how this story ended. Because while they were planning lilies and string quartets, I was planning the obituary. And trust me, it wouldn't be the eulogy they expected. The hospital room had settled into that strange hush that always seems to come in the hours before dawn. The slow, expectant silence of a place where lives end and begin. The hallway lights glowed dimly, and the only sounds were the mechanical whirring of her oxygen machine and the occasional creak of the old building settling into its bones. She'd been drifting in and out for days. Every time she woke, her eyes seemed more distant, searching for something that even I couldn't give her. The painkillers made her heavy-lidded, her breaths shallow and uneven. I'd learned the rhythm by then, the sudden gasps, the ragged sighs. Her children, my husband's siblings, had long since gone home. Alexander had a critical conference call first thing in the morning. Victoria had a hair appointment she simply couldn't cancel. Catherine had stayed the longest, but even she had eventually slipped away, promising to return at sunrise. And so it was just me again, the final caretaker at the end of the line. I pulled the chair close to her bedside, wrapping the scratchy hospital blanket around my shoulders. I watched her chest rise and fall, the labored cadence that told me we were almost there. She stirred, her thin fingers twitching against the starched sheet. I reached for her hand, remembering all the times I'd done the same. At home, in the kitchen, in the garden when her arthritis had made every step a struggle. It had always been me. I was the one who'd stayed when everyone else had called in their excuses from the safety of their own lives. She opened her eyes slowly, as if it took every ounce of strength she had left. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't see me at all, that I'd just be a blurry figure at the edge of her vision. But then, somehow, she focused. Her gaze found mine. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice so fragile it barely reached my ears. I nodded, blinking back tears. "I'm here, Mom," I said, using the word she'd never asked for, but that I'd adopted nonetheless. A small, tired smile. You stayed," she murmured. "Of course I did." She turned her head slowly, as if even that tiny movement was an effort. "I always knew you. You'd be the one," she said, her words broken by shallow breaths. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I promised Charles I'd take care of you. And I did." A tear slid down her cheek. "You did. More than anyone," she managed, her voice fading. "More than my own." I squeezed her hand gently. "Rest now, Mom," I whispered. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused again. But then, as if a spark had lit inside her, she turned her gaze back to me, suddenly sharp and clear. "Don't let them," she started, but the words dissolved in a cough. I leaned closer. "Don't let them what?" Her chest rose, struggled, fell. "Don't let them take it all." I felt my breath catch. "I won't," I promised, my voice steady even as my heart threatened to break. "I promise you, Mom." Her hand relaxed in mine, her chest stilled. I waited for the next breath, but it never came. The machine beeped its flat final note. I sat there for a long time, her hand still in mine. The sun was just beginning to warm the horizon outside the window, a delicate pink line edging the sky. Eventually, the nurse came in. She checked the machine, the chart, and then turned to me with kind, tired eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her voice the gentle murmur of someone who's spoken those words too many times to count. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The nurse busied herself with the necessary tasks, her movements efficient, respectful. She pulled the sheet up to my mother-in-law's chest, smoothed it over her thin shoulders. When the nurse left, I stood and brushed a lock of hair from the old woman's forehead. "Rest well," I whispered. As I left the room, the promise I'd made to her echoed in my mind. Don't let them take it all. And I wouldn't. The morning after her passing, the house felt impossibly quiet. Even the kitchen clock seemed to tick too loudly, filling the rooms she'd once ruled with its relentless, steady rhythm. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place I'd written grocery lists, meal plans, and appointment reminders. This time, though, the task before me was far heavier. Writing her obituary. Her children had already started texting me, their messages pinging in a steady stream. Questions about the funeral arrangements, the reading of the will, the estate. Each message buzzed with the urgency of vultures circling a fresh carcass. Yet not one of them had asked how I was holding up. Not one had offered to help write the words that would define her life's final chapter. Of course not. That was my job. It always had been. I opened a fresh Word document on my laptop. The blinking cursor felt like a dare. How do you sum up a woman's life in a few hundred words? Especially when that woman's life had been so tangled, so messy, so full of grudges and resentments, and yet had moments of unexpected grace. They'd expect the usual platitudes. Beloved mother, cherished grandmother, pillar of the community. The usual lines they'd want to read to their friends at the country club, with trembling lips and forced tears. I could almost hear Victoria's voice reading it aloud, her voice trembling on command, but her eyes dry as dust. But I wasn't going to give them that. Not this time. I typed the first line. Margaret Annette Whitmore Hamilton passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 92. surrounded by the love of the family who was always by her side. The family who was always by her side. That would be me. I paused, the cursor blinking expectantly. I could feel the weight of all those years pressing down on me. The doctor's visits, the sleepless nights, the meals she refused to eat, the stories she told on repeat. The children who dropped in once every few months with their bright smiles and empty hands. I kept writing, she is survived by her children, Victoria, Alexander, and Catherine, and by her devoted daughter-in-law, Margaret, who cared for her with unwavering compassion in her final years. I wondered if they'd even read that part, or if they'd skim past it, eyes searching for their own names like miners searching for gold. The cursor blinked again. I thought about her stories, so many stories, and the grudges she'd clung to with the tenacity of a barnacle on a boat hull. I thought about the fights, the tears, the whispered promises she'd made that I'd kept even when no one else bothered to remember them. Margaret was a woman of strong opinions, I wrote. She lived her life on her own terms, often challenging those around her to be better, stronger, and more accountable. She was known for her sharp wit, her keen mind, and her stubborn independence. I hesitated, fingers poised over the keyboard. Should I mention the fights? The bitterness? The inheritance she dangled like a carrot before her children's eyes, only to yank it back at the last second? Number. This wasn't the place to air every piece of dirty laundry. But I wasn't about to let them write the sanitized version of her life either. I wrote, though she often found herself at odds with others, Margaret valued loyalty above all. She was quick to test it, and just as quick to reward those who proved worthy. I thought about the day I found the draft of her will in the attic, her scrawled notes about each child, the hesitant question marks beside Victoria and Alexander's names. And my name, circled, underlined, with the words, she stayed. I kept typing, Margaret was preceded in death by her husband, Charles Hamilton, who adored her, and leaves behind a legacy that will live on in those who truly knew her. I read the words over and over. A legacy that will live on in those who truly knew her. It wasn't flowery. It wasn't polite. But it was the truth. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair. My coffee had gone cold, untouched. I could hear the sound of birds outside, and for a moment, the world felt too bright for a day like this. My phone buzzed again. Victoria, asking if I'd finished that little piece, yet so she could approve it before it ran. Approve it. I let the phone ring. For once, I didn't jump to answer. Instead, I sat there with the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept, and the certainty that when the obituary hit the paper, they'd finally see the truth. Because I'd written her story, and this time, it wasn't just for them. The obituary hit the paper 2 days after I wrote it. I hadn't changed a single word, despite Victoria's thinly veiled request to tweak a few lines for clarity. It was published as I intended, a final testament to the truth of who Margaret Annette Whitmore Hamilton had been, and a quiet middle finger to every polite lie they'd whispered behind closed doors. By noon that day, my phone buzzed like an angry hornet's nest. Missed calls from Victoria, first one, then another, then 5 more in a row. Texts from Alexander, laced with icy politeness that dripped sarcasm in every carefully chosen word. Well written, Margaret. Interesting choice of tone. Catherine's message was shorter, more hesitant. That was honest. Can we talk? Honest. There it was. The one thing they'd all tried to avoid for years. The first call I answered was from Victoria. Her voice was tight, the same way it had been whenever she'd graciously offered to relieve me for a weekend so I could rest. I read the obituary, she said, skipping any greeting. I'm glad you did, I replied, as evenly as I could manage. She sniffed, probably a dramatic pause she'd practiced in the mirror. You could have mentioned the charity work, or the garden club, or her bridge championship. Those things were part of her, I agreed. But I chose to highlight what really defined her life: her independence, her strength, and the loyalty she expected from the people around her. And you, she shot back. You made it sound like you were the only one who cared for her. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, that's exactly how it had been. Victoria had been too busy, too important, too detached. Alexander had called once a month, if that. Catherine had tried, but she'd always stopped short of the hard parts. Margaret, Victoria continued, her voice trembling with indignation. This was supposed to be a family tribute. It was, I said. A tribute to the family that was actually here, every day. Click. She hung up on me. Alexander's response came through email, his preferred medium when emotions ran high. He wrote in the same clipped tone he'd used on me the night I asked him to pick up his mother's prescription, and he'd reminded me he had real work to do. Margaret, it began, I must express my disappointment at the tone of the obituary. It read more like a personal vendetta than a respectful farewell. I trust you'll leave the eulogy to the rest of us. I read his message twice, letting the hypocrisy sink in. This from the man who had once suggested, maybe it's time to consider a home, when his mother's health declined, conveniently forgetting that the home would have cost more than any of them were willing to chip in. Catherine, at least, had the decency to come see me in person. She brought flowers, white lilies, her mother's favorite, and a hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I read what you wrote, she said softly. I'm sure you did, I replied, stepping aside so she could come in. She stood in the hallway, looking small and uncertain. I didn't know. All of it, she said. The nights, the emergencies, the fights. I thought you were just strong. I was strong, I said, but I was also alone. She nodded, tears brimming. I'm sorry, she whispered, for everything. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that her apology fixed everything. But the truth was, it didn't. It couldn't. Some cracks run too deep to simply plaster over. Still, I reached out and hugged her. Because in that moment, I needed to believe that at least one of them understood. The funeral was scheduled for the following weekend, and by then, the obituary had become the talk of the extended family. Distant cousins who'd only ever sent Christmas cards called to offer condolences, but even they couldn't resist slipping in a casual, "That was quite an obituary you wrote." Yes, I'd reply. It was. No one seemed to know how to respond. Victoria took control of the funeral arrangements, determined to wrest back some measure of control over the narrative. She called the florist, the caterer, the church. She drafted a eulogy that painted her mother as a saint, a paragon of virtue, the glue that had held the family together. I let her have it. She needed it. And maybe the others did too. But when I stood by the casket that day, watching the steady stream of polite mourners file past, I knew that every single person in that room, every cousin, every neighbor, every friend, had read my words. They'd seen the truth, or at least a sliver of it, and they'd felt something. Maybe anger, maybe respect, maybe even guilt. The aftermath wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, I wasn't the invisible caretaker in the background. I was the woman who had written the truth, unvarnished, unsanitized, and unapologetic. And no matter how the family tried to spin it, that truth was out there now, and it was mine. The day of the funeral dawned cold and overcast, a fitting backdrop for the performance I knew was coming. I had chosen a simple black dress, one that wouldn't draw attention, although after the obituary, I knew I'd already earned my share of whispers. Let them talk. I'd spent years being the silent caretaker in the background. Today, I would stand quietly at the front, but with my head held high. The service was held at St. Luke's, the same church where my husband and I had renewed our vows on our 25th anniversary. I had sat in these pews countless times, but never had I felt so out of place. The church had been decorated with white lilies, Margaret's favorite, and roses, a small nod to her softer side that few people had actually known. Victoria arrived first, dressed like a movie star in a tailored black coat, with a matching hat that cast a dramatic shadow over her perfectly made-up face. She floated down the aisle like she owned the place, pausing only to greet the pastor with a tight smile. "Margaret," she said, her voice syrupy, "thank you for coming." I resisted the urge to laugh. "Of course, I wouldn't miss it," I replied, my tone even. Alexander arrived next, stiff and formal, his expression locked in that polite mask he wore whenever feelings were inconvenient. He clasped my hand briefly and offered a wooden, "Thank you for everything," his eyes darting away almost before the words left his lips. Catherine slipped in quietly, looking small and vulnerable, her eyes red-rimmed. She reached for my hand and squeezed it, holding on for a moment longer than necessary. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded, though the truth was more complicated. As the pews filled, I scanned the faces of the extended family. Cousins who'd never bothered to call, nieces and nephews who hadn't sent so much as a birthday card in years, neighbors who'd waved politely but never offered a helping hand. Each one carried an air of solemnity, but beneath it was a barely concealed curiosity. What would the family do now? How would they handle the fallout from the obituary? The service began, and the pastor spoke in gentle, soothing tones about Margaret's strength, her devotion, and her unwavering love. I wondered how much he'd charged for that particular sermon, because the reality was that Margaret had been equal parts loving and formidable. Her love had come with conditions, her devotion a double-edged sword. Then Victoria stood to give the eulogy. She started strong, weaving tales of a mother who'd always put her family first. "Her home was always open," Victoria said, voice trembling perfectly on cue. "She made the best apple pie, and she never forgot a birthday." I wondered if she'd even known about the pie crust recipe I'd found, tattered and stained, in the back of a kitchen drawer. Probably the last time her mother had made it herself, before arthritis turned every chore into a battlefield. Victoria spoke of holidays, of laughter around the table, of traditions that had always brought us together. I remembered holidays spent with me in the kitchen, sweating over a turkey while Margaret supervised from her recliner, and Victoria dropped by for 15 minutes, complaining about the traffic. Alexander took his turn next. He kept it short, like always. "Mom taught us the value of hard work," he said, eyes fixed somewhere above the heads of the congregation. "She was a guiding light." Guiding light? I thought bitterly. She was a taskmaster, demanding and exacting, and when she called for help, it was me who showed up, not him. Catherine was last, her voice soft and trembling with real emotion. "She was complicated," Catherine admitted, "but she loved fiercely, and she taught me so much. I wish I'd told her more often." At least Catherine acknowledged the truth. Margaret had been complicated. She'd loved fiercely, but she'd also hurt fiercely, and she'd left wounds that wouldn't heal with eulogies and lilies. When it was my turn, I didn't stand. I simply placed a hand on the edge of the casket and whispered, "Goodbye, Margaret," letting the words carry the weight of years spent in the trenches of caretaking. I owed her that much, and no more. After the service, the reception was held at Victoria's home. The air smelled of coffee and perfume, and the kitchen overflowed with catered sandwiches and polite conversation. I found myself standing alone by the window, watching the guests mill about, balancing plates of food like props in a play. "You really put it all out there in that obituary," Alexander said, coming to stand beside me. "I told the truth," I replied simply. He nodded, looking uncomfortable. "I guess. Maybe I didn't realize how much you did." I didn't say anything. It wasn't my job to soothe his conscience. Victoria passed by, her smile tight and brittle. "Well, at least she got a good send-off," she said. "Yes," I agreed, meeting her gaze without flinching. She did. The funeral was over, but the aftermath had only just begun. The truth was out there now. No more hiding behind polite pretenses and half-truths. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday, at exactly 10 a.m. sharp. Victoria had insisted on that time. She had a conference call at noon, she'd said, and didn't want to waste the entire day dragging out family drama. Alexander agreed with her, as he usually did, while Catherine simply nodded, eyes downcast. For my part, I didn't care what time it happened. I'd been waiting years for this moment, though not for the reasons they assumed. The attorney, Mr. Jennings, a man with neatly combed hair and a voice like a funeral bell, sat at the head of the long conference table in his sleek modern office. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. I took a seat near the window, where I could watch the city skyline as the others trickled in. Victoria arrived first, clicking her stilettos like a metronome of impatience. She wore a designer suit that probably cost more than my first car and carried an air of entitlement that filled the room before she even spoke. Alexander was right behind her, his expression that same polite mask he'd worn at the funeral, except now it had an undercurrent of expectation. Catherine slipped in last, looking tired but resolute, her hands folded in her lap like a child bracing for a scolding. Mr. Jennings cleared his throat and began with the formalities, reading aloud a brief statement about the estate's considerable assets and personal items of sentimental value. Victoria's eyes lit up at the mention of assets, and Alexander leaned forward, fingers drumming on the table. I sat back, watching, knowing they'd be in for a surprise. "Margaret Hamilton," Mr. Jennings read, "being of sound mind and memory, hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." He paused dramatically, glancing around the room, then continued. "I wish to first acknowledge my children, Victoria, Alexander, and Catherine, whose lives have been intertwined with mine in ways both joyful and challenging." Victoria's lips twitched at that, a forced smile that never reached her eyes. "To each of you, I leave a token of my affection," Mr. Jennings continued, his voice steady. "Victoria, I leave you my mother's diamond brooch, the one you admired so often." Victoria blinked, her smile freezing in place. I remembered the brooch, a delicate thing with missing stones, probably worth more in sentiment than cash. I wondered if Victoria had ever realized it was paste, not real diamonds. "Alexander," Mr. Jennings said, "I leave you my father's gold pocket watch, the one he carried every day until his passing. May it remind you of time well spent and the value of every hour." Alexander exhaled, his face pinched. That watch was precious, sentimentally, not financially. "Catherine," Mr. Jennings continued, "I leave you my journals, my memories, thoughts, and reflections from the past 50 years. I hope they give you insight into who I was, beyond the roles I played." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, and I felt a pang of sympathy. She'd been the only one who ever tried to know Margaret beyond the surface. Then Mr. Jennings paused, glancing at me. "And to Margaret's caregiver, whom she described in this document as her unwavering source of compassion and strength." Victoria's head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing. I leave a sum equal to that which I would have left to each of my children, in recognition of the countless hours, emotional support, and personal sacrifices made on my behalf. You could have heard a pin drop. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Alexander's face flushed a deep crimson, and Catherine looked down at her lap, tears brimming. Mr. Jennings continued, "Furthermore, I leave to the same caregiver full authority to distribute or donate any remaining household items and personal effects as she sees fit, with the exception of the aforementioned items." Victoria's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "This is outrageous," she spat. "She barely even knew." "She knew enough," I said quietly. "Enough to understand who actually showed up when she needed help. Enough to know who made the phone calls, scheduled the appointments, and sat by her bedside at 3 a.m. Alexander opened his mouth, but for once he had no words. Catherine's eyes met mine with something like understanding. Mr. Jennings cleared his throat. "Margaret was very clear in her instructions," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Her estate plan was reviewed and witnessed according to all legal requirements." Victoria slumped back in her chair, arms crossed like a petulant child. Alexander stared at the table. The room felt heavy with unspoken truths. The years they hadn't called, the holidays they'd skipped, the emergencies they'd ignored. The weight of that neglect now sat squarely on their shoulders, disguised as an inheritance they'd never expected to share. As the meeting wrapped up, I gathered my papers and rose. Victoria's voice followed me, tight and angry. "You think you've won something, don't you?" I turned to face her, my own expression calm. "No, Victoria. I didn't win anything. I earned it." She recoiled as if slapped. Catherine reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you," she whispered. I nodded, grateful that at least one of them understood. The will reading ended in a daze of disbelief and stifled rage, the echoes of Victoria's outburst still buzzing in my ears. But as I walked out of that sterile conference room, the weight I'd carried for years felt lighter, as if someone had finally lifted the anchor from my chest. For the first time in a long while, I felt untethered, like maybe the world didn't have to revolve around someone else's needs anymore. The drive home was oddly quiet. My car, a modest, reliable sedan, felt like a cocoon of solitude, a place where I could finally breathe without hearing her voice asking for another glass of water, another pillow, another complaint. The city rolled by outside my window. Strip malls, gas stations, tidy neighborhoods where lives carried on without the constant, relentless burden of being someone's caretaker. I wondered what it would be like to live like that, unburdened. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a moment with the engine idling, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if bracing for something. But nothing happened. No calls from the hospital. No shrill voice from the next room. Just silence. Glorious, fragile silence. Inside the house, the air felt different. Lighter, less oppressive. The rooms were still cluttered with reminders of her. The worn throw on the couch she'd insisted on keeping even when the stuffing poked through. The chipped teacup she always insisted on using. The faint smell of lavender that clung to every corner like a stubborn ghost. But even those relics felt less suffocating now. They were just things, no longer heavy with the weight of obligation. For years I'd defined myself by what she needed. Every doctor's appointment, every prescription, every phone call from a distant relative who couldn't be bothered to visit, but always had opinions on how I should do things. It all revolved around her. My days were measured in pills dispensed and meals prepared, in sighs and eye rolls, and the constant feeling that no matter what I did, it was never quite enough. Now, with the finality of the will reading, I realized what I'd actually inherited: my freedom. It wasn't about the money. though her estate had left me a sum equal to each of her children's shares, a gesture that made Victoria's face contort with rage. No, it was about the realization that I no longer had to ask permission to live my own life. I could wake up without wondering what crisis awaited me in the next room. I could make plans without the constant fear of being summoned at the worst possible moment. I didn't have to be the caretaker anymore. I could just be me. I spent the next few days packing away her belongings. Some things I donated, others I kept, out of obligation, or maybe just habit. I found her old letters in a shoebox, yellowed and fragile, filled with stories of her younger days, her first love, her disappointments, her grudges. The same grudges she'd carried into every conversation, every family gathering. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply sorted and sifted, feeling a quiet sense of closure with every item I let go. It's funny how freedom isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper that seeps in around the edges of your life, reminding you that you're more than what you've carried, more than the caretaker, more than the stand-in mother, more than the convenient scapegoat for a family that couldn't face its own failures. Victoria called once, a week after the reading. She wanted to discuss next steps for clearing out the house and disposing of her mother's personal effects. Her voice was clipped, businesslike, as if she were discussing a corporate merger instead of the remnants of a woman's life. "Don't worry about it," I told her, my tone even. "I've already started." She paused, surprised, and for the first time, I heard a note of uncertainty in her voice. "Well, okay, just let me know if you find anything valuable." I nearly laughed. Valuable. I'd already found what was valuable, and it wasn't hidden in boxes or safety deposit slips. It was the knowledge that I had given more than any of them ever had, and that I had nothing left to prove. The freedom was mine now. It felt like an inheritance I'd earned, every bit as much as any dollar amount in her will. As I locked the front door that evening, the house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a place I could choose to leave, or to stay in, on my own terms. I didn't owe anyone explanations or apologies. I'd spent years caring for a woman who rarely said thank you. Now it was time to care for myself. The real inheritance wasn't the money or the silver or the chipped teacup. It was the permission, finally, to live a life of my own making. And for the first time in years, I was ready to claim it. The day after the will reading, I woke to a sunrise that felt different than all the ones before it. It wasn't a particularly spectacular sunrise, just a gentle blush over the horizon. But it felt like the first morning I'd ever truly owned. No early calls, no medication schedules, no passive-aggressive sighs from the next room. Just me, the birds outside the window, and a steaming mug of coffee that tasted like freedom. I'd expected to feel guilt. For months, years really, I'd rehearsed the lines I'd say to myself. You should have done more. You should have been more patient. You should have tried harder. But now, standing there with the sun on my face and the last chapter of my male's life finally closed, the guilt never came. Relief, yes. Peace, definitely. But guilt? That weight had finally lifted. The obituary had rattled the family, I knew that much. Victoria's voice on the phone had been brittle with rage, and Alexander's icy silence spoke volumes about the cracks that would never fully heal. Catherine had tried to play the peacemaker, but even she couldn't bridge a chasm that had been dug over decades. Still, none of that was my burden to carry anymore. I spent the next week slowly reclaiming the corners of my home, one room at a time. The living room felt bigger without her recliner parked at the perfect angle to the TV. The kitchen smelled fresher without the constant scent of her special diet meals simmering away. Even the hallway seemed brighter without her framed cross-stitch slogans, "Family first," and "Home is where the heart is." which had always felt like passive-aggressive reminders of a standard I could never quite meet. I found myself humming while I cleaned, little tunes I hadn't thought of in years. My steps felt lighter. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror one afternoon, and for the first time, I saw a woman with her own life, a woman who'd earned every wrinkle, every line, every tired smile, and she looked happy. The phone calls from the family trickled in at first, some pretending to check on me, others fishing for information about the estate. Victoria's tone was particularly sharp, full of barbed questions disguised as polite concern. "How are you holding up?" she'd ask, but I could hear the undertone. "Are you going to contest the will? Are you going to make this harder for us?" I didn't, because I didn't need to. I'd had my say in the obituary, my quiet, dignified truth. I'd stood my ground at the will reading, where she'd divided things equally, leaving no room for Victoria's manipulations. I'd kept my dignity intact, and that was enough. Every time I felt that old urge to defend myself, to justify the choices I'd made over all those years of care, I reminded myself of the simple truth. I did the best I could with what I had. I'd been there when it counted, at every doctor's appointment, every hospital visit, every midnight panic. I'd given her kindness when no one else bothered, even when she didn't always give it back. No regrets. The house was quiet now, and I found I liked it that way. I started small rituals just for me, reading on the porch, walking the dog at sunset, cooking meals that didn't require me to cater to anyone else's dietary quirks. I planted flowers in the garden, bright, hopeful bursts of color that felt like a promise of something new. The family still tried to loop me in sometimes. Emails about dividing up heirlooms, group texts about a memorial service that Victoria was planning with her characteristic flair. I replied politely but firmly, setting my boundaries. "Thank you for including me, but I'll be keeping my distance," I wrote once. And it felt good, like drawing a line in the sand that said, "This is where I end and you begin." Sometimes I wondered what she'd think of me now, this woman she'd once called too soft, too eager to please, too much of a people pleaser. I think she'd be shocked, or maybe, in some small way, proud that I finally learned to stand on my own. One morning, a letter came in the mail from Catherine, a simple note in her neat, precise handwriting. "I know it wasn't easy. Thank you for everything you did. I'm sorry we didn't see it sooner." I cried then, just a little. Not because I needed their approval, but because it felt like closure, like someone had finally seen me. The relief, the peace, the quiet. Those were my real inheritance. Not the money or the house or the chipped china cups, but the knowledge that I'd survived. I'd given all I could, and now, for the first time in a long time, I could give something back to myself. No regrets, just relief, and a life that, at last, felt like it was truly mine. And so that's the story of how my role as a daughter-in-law, caretaker, and unofficial family referee came to a bittersweet close. I spent years pouring my time, money, and, most importantly, my heart into caring for someone who sometimes appreciated it, sometimes didn't, and sometimes outright resented me. But I kept going. Not for applause, not for a place in her will, but because that's what I do. Because it was the right thing, even if it was the hard thing. They say you reap what you sow. And while I may not have reaped family accolades or a trophy for world's best daughter-in-law, I did harvest something much more valuable. A sense of peace that comes from knowing I did the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. I carried the weight they wouldn't, so they could drop by when it suited them and make empty promises they never intended to keep. I made sure she had dignity and comfort in her final days, even when it meant sacrificing my own. And when the time came, I wrote the truth. Not to be cruel or vindictive, but because the truth matters. Her obituary didn't sugarcoat the way she lived or the way they behaved. It didn't hide the reality of the burden that fell on my shoulders when the rest of the family found excuses to be anywhere but here. I wrote it because someday, when my own story is told, I hope someone will say, "She did what she had to do. She told the truth. She didn't let others define her." If you found yourself nodding along, if you've ever felt the thankless weight of caring for someone while others reaped the easy moments, then know this: you are not alone. You are stronger than they realize, and your story deserves to be told. Thank you for listening to mine. If you're looking for more stories that shine a light on the hidden corners of family dynamics, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. There's more where this came from. Until next time, take care of yourself too.